Hi, my name's Krista Edmonds. I'd like to thank the Nickel Galleries for having me here today to talk about Bitcoin in the context of their War Symposium. My talk is entitled Bitcoin, the Battle for Peace. I'd like to firstly touch on the reasons why we go to war, and then talk about how the fiat system incentivizes wars, what the impact of this is, and what Bitcoin has to do with any of this. So, firstly, let's look at the reasons why we go to war. When humans were in nomadic tribes, we were constantly on the move and we didn't have permanent settlements for the most part. So, there were very few wars. And if there were, they were very small in scale, where two different bands might meet and have a skirmish. And they were very short lived because there was no territory to defend. About 10,000 years ago, Eurasia started to transition to agriculture, and this increased the incentives for engaging in territorial disputes because people now had territories where they were growing food that they needed to defend. There are lots of different reasons why there are incentives for wars, but one of them is economic stimulus. So it can be politically expedient to wage war to stimulate the economy, create an issue that everybody can get behind, and wars can also be very useful at distracting the populace from problems back home. Another reason for engaging war is defense, and I think this is probably the only legitimate case for going to war, is to defend your territory, your property, or your person, or the persons of your family and friends. Another reason for engaging war is theft of productivity. Why work when you can steal? So, for example, if you enslave other people, you are stealing their productivity. Another reason for waging war might be piracy. So, you're stealing stuff that humans have created rather than creating it yourself. And empire expansion really encompasses all of these, but also includes the theft of territory. So, oftentimes, nation states or tribes would invade other people's lands, stealing their land, enslaving them, and stealing the products that they had produced. It's no real coincidence that slavery was abolished in the US not very long after oil became commercialized. There are many reasons why slavery ended, and there were many people working for decades to bring that industry to an end. However, the first commercial oil well went into production in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859. In 1865, slavery was abolished in the US. So the economic incentives for engaging in the enslavement of people had become less and less after the discovery of oil. So, how does the fiat system enable wars? Well, there are three primary ways in which you can finance a war. So, one is taxation, and this requires whoever the monarch or whoever the leader of a particular piece of land is, to go to the population of that land and ask them for money. Now, this may be done on a voluntary basis or through coercion. But taxation is one way of raising funds in order to go to war. But often you need, to some extent, the buy-in of the people living on that territory. Another way of financing wars is through debts. So before central banks, monarchs would often go to money lenders, and those could be families that were wealthy in their own right and had excess funds that they were willing to lend to the monarch in order for that monarch to engage in wars. And that monarch would then pay them back theoretically for the debt pay back the debt with interest. Another way of engaging in war is theft. So if you go and steal from others, you can use those goods that you have looted to pay for mercenaries to go and engage in war on your behalf as well. I recently visited Innsbruck in Austria. And for those that haven't been there, there's a palace there called the Habsburg or Hofsburg Palace, depending on whether you're taking the Germanic or English name. That's an extremely beautiful, very gilded, very rich building. And it was built by the Habsburgs, who are very famous for the Habsburg chin or Habsburg jaw, which was a hereditary deformity that they had. But they were also the heads of the Holy Roman Empire, as it was then called. So this is an image on the left of Charles V, who was a Habsburg. You can see his very pronounced chin in the portrait. And he borrowed heavily from bankers because there were no central banks to fund wars, primarily in defense of what was then called the Holy Roman Empire, in defense of the Reformation movement. Charles drained the coffers of revenues. He left huge debts, but he also benefited very much from the fact that around the same time the Spanish had conquered the Incas and the Aztecs. Now, the Incas and the Aztecs had huge amounts of gold. They saw gold as being very connected to their gods and being a product of sunshine, or the sun god that they worshipped. And the Habsburgs were able to take this looted gold and use that to fund wars and enrich themselves by building beautiful palaces and beautiful objects within those palaces. But however, King Charles did not factor in an element of that plan. So typically, gold would be mined at a rate of, say, about 2% a year. But there was a huge influx of this gold that came from what was then known as Peru, so Peruvian gold. But this really was the way that they used to describe all of the New World, as opposed to what we know as Peru today. And this influx of gold created a huge amount of inflation. So while it was great for building palaces and for funding wars, it also drove an inflationary environment. And I wanted to read a quote from Kwasi Kwarteng's book, War and Gold. Kwasi Kwarteng was the prior Chancellor of the Exchequer for the UK, but he has written this fascinating book that talks about how gold funded wars. And of this period, he says, the biggest economic effect of the discovery of the New World was the inflation which occurred as a result of the greater supply of precious metals. Prices in Spain in the first quarter of the 17th century were more than 3 times as high as 100 years previously. And though this does not seem to be a huge increase in the level of prices compared to modern developments, for contemporaries, it marked a significant change. A gold standard is very inconvenient to empire. So we saw the UK move away from the gold standard in the early 1900s. Prior to that, the UK had been fortunate in as much as it could export its inflation to the colonies. So the colonies were forced to bank with the Bank of England, and they were forced to deposit their wealth in British pounds. As the First World War started to kick off around 1914, the UK people, who at the time were operating on what approximated a gold standard, were storing their gold in the central bank. And they received paper money, which allowed them to redeem, which could be redeemed for this gold. But they started to lose faith in the ability of the Bank of England to pay back this gold. And so citizens wanted to convert their paper money back to gold, and this caused a run on the British pound. Now, the UK government decided to impose exchange controls, and it temporarily, quote unquote, suspended the redeemability of paper for gold. Now, like many temporary measures that government imposes, this actually became permanent and continued in perpetuity. And the UK essentially moved off of a gold standard from that time forward. Next, post-World War I, the USA became a safe haven for gold. So countries started depositing their reserves in the US, their gold reserves, and the US issued them with paper dollars. The UK at this point becomes much less important globally from a currency perspective, and the US dollar became the world's global reserve currency. However, the temptation to print money just proved a little bit too tempting. And the US started funding lots of programs in the 1960s, welfare programs that cost a huge amount of money. They then started engaging in wars in Vietnam. And eventually, the US could no longer maintain this facade of a gold standard. So in 1971, then President Nixon declared that the US would temporarily, again, there is that word temporarily, stop the exchange of US dollars for gold. The US de facto defaulted and moved to a fiat standard. And as the world's reserve currency, it basically brought the rest of the world with it. because the whole world was really dragged into a fiat standard at that point. The last major country to move off the gold standard was actually Switzerland, though. Switzerland officially abandoned the gold standard in 1999 when it joined the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and agreed to adopt a system of floating exchange rates. I would really encourage people to look at this website. WTF happened in 1971. It's a fantastic website that shows the impact that moving off of a gold standard had for the US. So you can see in this particular image how productivity continued to increase, and actually at a very steady pace as technology made everybody more efficient and made processes and production more efficient. But compensation completely stagnated from 1971 onwards. So basically, the value of people's wages, their purchasing power, has steadily gone down. And you can see in this particular image, which shows the devaluation of the US dollar, what the impact was of moving off the gold standard again. So there were lots of sort of peaks and troughs in the value of the dollar prior. But after 1971, the value of the dollar just steadily declines, precipitously, actually. The French Enlightenment writer Voltaire wrote, or allegedly said, that paper money eventually returns to its intrinsic value, which is zero. So how do governments now fund wars that they have moved away from a gold standard? Well, instead of taxing citizens, typically, they just print money, limitless money. Blissful ignorance. Because the money that governments use to fund wars is not acquired through taxation primarily, citizens are largely unaware that they are subject to a stealth tax, which is known as inflation. So as the government washes more money into the system, the purchasing power of their particular currency is being eroded without their direct knowledge or consent. This completely circumvents the democratic process, and it's also termed taxation without representation. I love this particular meme. Man struggling to feed his family is just happy he can fund wars with his taxes. So you are funding wars whether you support them or consent to them. And that's a very important thing to realize. So what has been the impact of this change in the currency systems on the war industry after the departure of the gold standard? Well, in case you had not noticed, the world is engaging in rather a lot of wars at the moment. This particular organization, the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, tracks data about the frequency and intensity of conflicts around the world. And you can see from this graph that there has been a steady increase in the number of conflicts occurring across the globe. Post 9/11, the US has spent $8 trillion on engaging in war. Much of this is funded through money printing as opposed to taxation. And there are also many issues around the fact that the Department of Defense often overspends with certain contractors. So they're basically paying certain contractors far more for certain services or for certain supplies than those supplies are actually worth, which would indicate that there is money being funneled through the system through a system of crony capitalism, where supporters of certain politicians and people who are funding them are actually receiving contracts from the government far in excess of the value of the product or service that they're actually generating. It's also important to look at the human cost of this system of limitless war funding. Fiat enables war crimes. Access to limitless free money creates poor incentives, and specifically the incentive to wage wars. This has led to a succession of illegal and unjust wars that are not directed at defending the homeland, and a corresponding series of war crimes. So I wanted to look at Obama first. So he actually received the Nobel Peace Prize right around the time that he came into office. During his tenure in office, 26,171 bombs were dropped on 7 countries, with at least 582 civilians killed. He also engaged in the extrajudicial killing of an American citizen, for which he was never charged. Bill Clinton authorized military action in Kosovo in 1999 over a period of 78 days. During that time, 1,500 civilians were killed. George Bush, where do we even start with George Bush? So George Bush lied about weapons of mass destruction with false evidence, essentially, from his security services, allegedly, and decided to take the US, along with the UK, into an invasion of Iraq. Since 2003, between 550 and 580,000 people have been killed in Iraq and Syria. This number does not include all of the civilian deaths in Afghanistan as well. The war was based on what has now been proved to be false evidence and was illegal. None of these three men, by the way, have ever been charged. We also need to consider the human cost, not just of those we wage war against, but also to our own troops. According to the US Department of Veteran Affairs, in 2021, 6,392 veterans died by suicide. You also need to consider that every single one of those veterans very likely had a partner and may have had children. So the impact isn't just on the individual life of that veteran, but also their families. You may be asking yourself at this point, why isn't anyone doing anything about this? Well, the answer is that they are. Julian Assange is the founder of a news organization called WikiLeaks. And he not recently, but in 2011, he was speaking at the Stop the War event in London. And this quote that I have on the screen comes from that one of the speeches that he gave at that event, or rather a side interview that he was giving to a journalist. He said that the goal is an endless war, not a successful war. So what's Julian's background here? Well, in 2010, he exposed war crimes committed by the US government via his news organization, WikiLeaks. And I think it's quite important to detail some of the war crimes that he exposed because they're extensive. So included in that leak were the Iraq war logs, which were 400,000 field reports describing 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians, as well as systematic rape, torture, and murder after US forces handed over detainees to a notorious Iraqi torture squad. They also contained the Afghan War Diary, in which 90,000 reports of more civilian casualties by coalition forces than the US military had reported. So they had underreported civilian casualties by 90,000, according to that report. They also included the Guantanamo files, which are 779 secret reports with evidence that 150 innocent people had been held at Guantanamo Bay for years, and 800 men and boys had been tortured and abused. These were violations of the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. They also include the notorious 2007 collateral murder video, which shows a US Apache attack helicopter targeting and killing 11 unarmed civilians. These included 2 Reuters journalists as well. A man who came to rescue the wounded was also attacked, and this is known as a double tap attack, where you attack a civilian and those coming to the aid of the injured person as well. That incident also included the 2 children who were injured in that occurrence. These are all illegal actions according to international agreements, and that video reveals evidence of 3 violations of the Geneva Conventions and the US Army Field Manual. I love this meme just because I think it's very on point. Again, it says these 3 men committed war crimes, so Obama, Bush, and Clinton. This man, i.e. Julian Assange, exposed their war crimes. Guess which one is in jail? So Julian Assange has now been in Belmarsh prison in the UK for the last 5 years. He has been charged by the US administration under the Espionage Act, but he has not been charged with any crime in the UK. He's currently fighting extradition to the US. And if he is extradited, he could face 175 years in jail. So he would basically die in prison in the US. This is actually the first time that a publisher has been charged under the Espionage Act. It's a pretty disgusting stain, really, on Britain and the British administration that we are imprisoning a man for exposing war crimes, especially as he hasn't committed any crime or been charged with any crime in the UK. So, as we look at the sheer magnitude of these crimes and the devastation and bloodshed that they cause, we should ask ourselves, who is benefiting from all of this? Well, I present you Exhibit A, Lockheed Martin, one of the world's largest military contractors. As you can see, post 9/11, US foreign policy has been hugely beneficial for their share price. We see the same trend with Northrop Grumman, another military contractor. Again, post 9/11, you can see a huge increase in their share price. So they've benefited hugely from US policy and the policy of other allies. Boeing, a slightly trickier example because they're having a few issues with planes falling out of the sky and doors flying off their planes, which is obviously impacting their share price somewhat. However, you can see the general trajectory also for them is a nice increase in share price post 9/11. So, how do they get away with all of this? Well, you may be familiar with the term manufacturing consent. Noam Chomsky wrote a whole book about this a few decades ago. Not only is the governing class circumventing the democratic process by funding wars via printed money, but they are also funding a relentless campaign of propaganda against their own citizens. I found this article on Yahoo Finance, which shows how some of this military spending is being framed. So the military spending in Ukraine is being framed as foreign aid, and the article says Washington is spending another $61 billion to help Ukraine, but most of that money will flow through the US economy first. And so this is being presented as a positive. Hey, don't worry, you get to benefit from this first. The new law will allow the Pentagon to send existing weapons, everything from bullets to missiles to tank parts, to Kiev, and then simultaneously backfill that inventory with new manufacturing efforts for US armories. There are 117 production lines in about 71 US cities that are set to produce those weapon systems, according to research from the American Enterprise Institute. So this military spending is being dressed up as foreign aid and is being presented as being helpful. And this is being used as a justification to fund the war in Ukraine, particularly during a period where this has become quite unpopular with the US electorate. I'd also like to look at some media coverage and how things are presented. So on the left, we have an image of several news headlines from the left-leaning New York Times in the US. How to choke Iraq. Bomb North Korea before it's too late. Bomb Syria, even if it's illegal. To stop Iran's bomb Iran. American bombs make Iraq stronger. Bombing Iraq isn't enough. And on the right, we have some representations of news outlets and how they have described Ukraine before the Russian invasion and then after the Russian invasion. So we see The Guardian, a left-leaning UK newspaper. Welcome to Ukraine, the most corrupt nation in Europe. Reuters, Ukraine's neo-Nazi problem. Vox, a Ukrainian comedian turned president is embroiled in Trump's impeachment mess. After the invasion, The Guardian says, the fight for Ukraine is a fight for liberal ideals. Reuters, for foreign fighters, Ukraine offers purpose, camaraderie, and a cause. CNN, Ukrainians are giving two lessons in democracy that Americans have forgotten. So you can see how things are represented depending on which way the wind is blowing. A particularly egregious headline from the Washington Post. In the long run, wars make us safer and richer. Moreover, that claim is simply not true. The media, which is largely owned by the same group of shareholders who own the military contractors, have a vested interest in sowing discord. So, this is also a very important part of the strategy, because if you are busy arguing with each other, you are not paying attention to what they are up to. By this point, I hope that you might be interested in how you can peacefully remove your support for these atrocities. So, again, I found a fantastic meme that really represents this. Don't blame the clown for acting like a clown. Ask yourself why you keep going to the circus. So, we finally get to the piece about Bitcoin, because at this stage, you're probably wondering what on earth Bitcoin has to do with all of this. Well, it's my belief that Bitcoin represents a viable option for you that allows you to peacefully remove your support for the military industrial complex, the wars they wage, and those who fund them. So the question is, how do you do this? Well, step one is to defund the war machine by making war unaffordable. I'd like to say thank you to Street Cyber for allowing me to use their beautiful artwork as part of this presentation and for the promotion flyer. So how do we do that? Well, unlike fiat, Bitcoin issuance is capped at 21 million Bitcoin. A world that operates on a Bitcoin standard creates a disincentive to fund wars. Governments would be unable to print money to fund endless wars, and they would have to fund them via direct taxation, which means you would be fully aware of the spending that's been undertaken in your name. Most people are unaware of the power that they have. Bitcoin gives you the ability to peacefully exit the fiat system. So how will you do that? By saving and by transacting in Bitcoin. So what do I mean? Well, if you buy Bitcoin, you can use that to store your wealth. And that means that you won't be participating in the fiat system. Canada happens to have one of the best Bitcoin exchanges, which is fortunate for you guys being based in Canada. So Bull Bitcoin is a non-custodial Bitcoin-only exchange and payment service. I've used it myself. It's a really fantastic service, and I strongly recommend it for anybody in the Canadian nation who is interested in purchasing Bitcoin. Also, you can become your own bank. So you can, by self-custodying Bitcoin, you no longer need banking services because you're custodying your own wealth, or you start to exit the banking system, I should say. Moreover, Bitcoin held in self-custody cannot be easily seized. The crazy thing about Bitcoin, believe this or not, is that you can store your private key, which is what allows you to access and move your funds, by using 12 specific words held in a certain order. Now, you can memorize those 12 words, which means you can essentially store your money in your head simply by memorizing those 12 words. It sounds crazy, but it's true. And it's one of the most powerful things about Bitcoin, in my opinion, that there is. The other thing is to start transacting in Bitcoin. So there's a great app that you can download called BTC Map, and it details the thousands of businesses across the world that already accept Bitcoin. I think Calgary has about 20 businesses already listed there where you can transact in Bitcoin. And as you can see from the map, there are many, many places in North America and across Canada where you can find businesses that will allow you to pay in Bitcoin. Holiday with Bitcoin. So El Salvador became the first country in the world in 2021 to make Bitcoin legal tender. I know people that live there full time and live fully on a Bitcoin standard. So they earn their wages in Bitcoin. They pay for their rent. They pay for all of their food, all of their travel, their Ubers, everything in Bitcoin. I also know people that spend several months of the year there or just visit on holiday, and all of them have been able to exist in El Salvador fully on a Bitcoin standard. Most of all, and most importantly, knowledge is power. So I would strongly encourage everybody to study Bitcoin. Aside from the fact that it's probably the most fascinating topic I've ever come across, and you will learn so much about everything, not just limited to the monetary system, but just so many other different disciplines will come into your study about Bitcoin. But knowledge is power. So understanding how Bitcoin works will allow you to adopt it and use it and really understand how you can use this particular technology to exit the war system. the military industrial complex system. Some lovely person projected this particular image onto the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. I thought this was very appropriate, so I thought it'd be great to show you guys that image. Shilling my own product, you can join Access Tribe. So I run a Bitcoin community for women, but we also have lots of free content that is accessible to anyone, not just members, including a podcast and a newsletter. You can also listen to talks and join training programs and find out about jobs in the Bitcoin ecosystem and connect with the community. Meet other Bitcoiners in real life. So in Calgary, you're particularly lucky because the city has one of the best Bitcoin meetups in Canada. You can find out information about their meetup at yycbitcoin.com. They meet about every 2 weeks usually, and they have a huge variety of really fascinating content and a very committed community that's very generous with their time in sharing learnings and education about Bitcoin. Calgary also has its own Bitcoin conference. So a few days before the Stampede kicks off, the Bitcoin Rodeo is hosted at the Grand in downtown Calgary. And that's a great place to meet Bitcoiners from all over the world and all sorts of different disciplines who come and talk about Bitcoin over the course of 2 days. And lastly, you can take the opportunity to connect with organizations in Canada, such as the Bitcoin Coalition of Canada, who are engaged in policy work and education. I recently joined their education committee, and we are working to make Bitcoin education accessible to everyone. So I would strongly encourage people to go to their website. There are some fantastic resources there, and it's a great organization to connect with. And finally, I would just like to say thank you for your time today. It has been an honor and a pleasure to present on this very important subject that is very near and dear to my heart. I hope that you've enjoyed the talk and that it has given you some new insights into why we continue to engage in so many wars, as well as concrete steps that you can take to remove your participation in the slaughter of your fellow human beings. And on that note, I would love to open it up for questions now if anyone has any.